Welcome, welcome, Pixel Poppers. We're up for our next beautiful talk. 2 people, 3 years, 4 platforms, a Path of Motus Post-Mortem with Michael Hicks. Michael Hicks is an independent game designer and musician. His most recent project is the Path of Motus for PlayStation 4, Xbox One, and Nintendo Switch. Michael's games have been played by over 500,000 players worldwide and have been featured in publications such as Game Informer, Official Xbox Magazine, Wired, Engadget, Ars Technica, and more. He also runs a YouTube channel with the goal of teaching other people to make games. And with that, I welcome Michael Hicks.
Hi. Okay. So today I'm going to talk about a game I worked on with a friend of mine for 3 years, like the title says. To give a little plug to the guy that was on the team with me, his name's Goncalo Antunes, and he's from Portugal, but he couldn't make it here today. But he did all of the art on the game. So I'm going to talk about the development process of the game, but first I want to give a quick intro about me. I'm an indie developer, and I've been doing this full-time, or professionally, for 8 years. I started in high school. I put out some games on Xbox 360, and I kind of just fell in love with doing it. Started off as just like a hobby thing, and I tried to turn it into a career, I guess. Some of the things I do, I program, I design, I do the music, the trailers, all that stuff, and then my friend Goncalo, he does the art and animation. So we're just a 2-person team for all of the games that we do. And we recently shipped Path of Motus for PS4, Xbox One, and Steam, and then the Switch release came a little later. That was actually this year, February. And then the other versions came out last July. So even though the game was worked on for like 3 years, the origins actually go way back before that. So I started working on an early concept I had for this game back in 2012. It was called something else back then. It was called Sententia, and I was in college at the time. I was really interested in trying to explore with game design and kind of find my own voice, I guess. I was interested in making what's up, Derek? I was interested in making, trying to make games that had gameplay that kind of interweaved with story a little bit better. I really love like RPGs where there's cool story, but as a player I always feel like there's a disconnect a lot of the times. Sometimes what you do in the story doesn't always connect with the gameplay. So obvious example would be like if in the story you're trying to be very altruistic and you're always trying to do the right thing, but in the gameplay you're like forced to kill people, and it always felt kind of weird to me. So I was trying to experiment, like I said, with designing a game where the gameplay was really meshed well with the story. So in 3 months I made this game called Sententia, and the premise of it is you're playing as this little goblin-looking creature down there by the bridge, and he's been trapped in a forest for hundreds of years. His whole village has been trapped, but he thinks he'll be the first one to get out by building these bridges through the forest. So there's some puzzle mechanics there where you draw lines between the nodes and make bridges. But in between building these bridges, he runs into these bullies that shout words at him. So it's there's like this verbal combat system. I don't want to say it's like Skyrim, but sort of, right? Like you're shouting these words and you have to match the correct shout to get through the enemy goblins or whatever. And I chose all these mechanics because I was really interested at the time. I was reading a lot and watching documentaries about creative people, and like this, they all kind of had a similar story of like they try to do something but everyone says, oh, you'll never do that, and then they kind of have to ignore it and do their own thing. So that was what inspired that aspect of it. So yeah, all of the mechanics I was trying to have it like link back into the story and the themes and so on. And it was part of the Indie Games Uprising 3, which was a promotion I helped coordinate on the Xbox 360. And we had pretty good press coverage. Most of the big websites covered it. I think it was, I think we had 8 games in the promotion, and Sententia was one of them. We even had a big feature on Xbox Live on the front page there. I actually picked Sententia as part of the banner. So we had a real great promotion, and I got to kind of explore with a different type of game design, learn a bunch of things. There's one problem though, and that was that no one really liked the game that much. It was my first platformer game I'd ever made, and I made a lot of mistakes that were frustrating. A lot of people rage quit because, well, I got a list of things here. There's like no logic to how I placed the platforms. Like a lot of the jumps were really tough to get across. You had to like get right on the edge to make the jumps. A lot of the puzzles weren't that interesting. They had like a bunch of different solutions, so you could kind of just do whatever and solve them. It wasn't all that great. The animations, we actually had, for like the running animation, there was like 3 frames, so it was like really choppy. It was like, so it was really bad. It was really bad. And the writing was cringy, and yeah, it was pretty bad. But I made it in 3 months, and it was just kind of like a quick little brain dump, right, of me trying to explore with some things. And yeah. But even though a lot of things didn't go right with it, I didn't think it was a total failure. The original creative ideas that I had with it, of trying to like make gameplay that meshed with the story and stuff, I thought that went pretty well. The problem was that it was executed so poorly, a lot of people couldn't see that except for me, right? So you have to kind of clean up the other stuff before that shines. But it made me think about game design in a different way, and that's good, right? Even though the other stuff was failing, it was inspiring enough, I saw enough there that I continued on with some of my ideas that I had. And after college, I went back home and I worked on a game called Pillar. And it was inspired by some of that design stuff that I was talking about. And the premise of Pillar is it's a collection of mini games where each game is a different character with a different personality. And each one of the characters you play as has totally different mechanics that represent their personality. So an example would be if you're an introverted person, introverts lose energy when they're around other people for too long. So there's like a stealth mechanic in that, where if you're around others, your energy bar drains, things like that. So we released that in February 2015 for PS4. It was a minor success. It did a lot better than Sententia. We had, I think, over 350,000 downloads on that and some good press coverage. We were in Game Informer and some cool things like that. So after Pillar came out, I was really excited about like trying to keep the momentum going, and I wanted to jump right into another project. And at the time we were working, Goncalo and I were working on a different game, but it was like it had this top-down perspective. And the art style was really like abstract and surreal, and he just wasn't enjoying doing art for it. And he was like, I wish we could just get back to doing like a flat, like platformer view game. And I had just played Sententia, and I was like, man, I really screwed this up. I wish I could have done a better job with the things I knew now about that game. So we just naturally came to the conclusion of, hey, let's just remake Sententia. That sounds cool. Like, okay. So we started. And this was probably the biggest mistake of the whole project. And that sounds maybe a little cynical, like it was a mistake to start or something. That's not quite what I'm saying. But what I am saying is if you care about selling games and making enough money to like do this full time, the concept phase is pretty important. You need to be thinking about, well, let's just, if you notice like how I decided to work on this game, it was kind of just curiosity, right? Like, oh, that sounds like a cool game idea, let's do that, you know? No thought at all went into communicating with the public, right? Like, how would I pitch this game? How would I talk about it? It was just, oh, that's a cool idea, let's do it. So it's really important, I think, to think about your game's hook. I have a little mental model I run through now. I have a whole list of game design ideas I'd like to do. And what I've found is that once I go through this little mental test, most of the game design ideas I have are really weird and probably don't warrant a 3-year development cycle, right? What I do is I imagine going into GameStop and pitching it to people in that store, like my game idea. I give them, the one-line pitch of this is what the game is and what you do. And I try to imagine those types of people, what their reaction would be. And then based off that little test I run, I mark my games from risky to very risky. There is no no risk concept, but I try to evaluate it a little bit, right? And I think, after doing all of this for several years, and I've been lucky enough to have some cool promotion on some of my stuff, I actually don't think that getting press coverage and YouTuber coverage and all that, I don't think that drives sales. I think what drives sales is having a concept that sells itself, and then you do some of those things to kind of light the fire and get people starting to talk about it, and then the rest of it just kind of naturally happens, right? So I think the GameStop test is very important. So after, let's say, I also want to say that I think the reason that a lot of indie games fail, most indie games fail commercially. Most indie games make under $10,000. It's the failure rate's way higher than the success rate, and we don't hear about that a whole lot, right? And I think the reason so many of these games fail, it can roughly be categorized into these reasons. People look at it and it doesn't seem well executed, like the art style is kind of janky, or it looks like someone drew it in paint or something like that. That can turn people off. Or it looks unoriginal or uninspired. I feel like a lot of indie games, they're kind of clones of certain things, especially when you're starting out. Like, I did it too. The first thing you want to do is you want to make a platformer, right? Like, that's kind of the first game genre you would try. But platformers actually aren't selling too well right now. They were like several years ago, like Super Meat Boy and games like that. But like, the sales are constantly shifting. People, shoot 'em ups and platformers are way on they're going down in terms of sales. Yeah, I think part of that also is because so many people come and make indie games, they make a platformer, right? So like saturates everything. Or another, the opposite problem of not being original enough is like you're making stuff that's so left field that people don't have a lot of interest in it. And I think that's me. That's most of my games, I think, is that. Or a fourth thing is you just don't have enough luck, right? There's a lot of luck that goes into this. Being at the right place at the right time, kind of like what I was saying earlier, making a game that meshes well with people's tastes currently. And that's always evolving, right? You can take an educated guess. That's what marketing people do. They say, well, people are buying this game, so let's make this. But eventually, 3 people fall on their face, and that's how you know that the market doesn't support that game anymore, right? So somewhere people have to fail, and that could be you. So I could be wrong, though. It's not a science, but that's my theory after going through all of this. But the point is that I wasn't thinking about any of it, right? Like I said, I was just, oh, that sounds cool, let's do it. So we jumped right into production, and in a few months I blocked out the first 3 levels. It's a 3-level game, 3 chapters. We had some concept art that Goncalo was doing, and it looked pretty good. I was like, all right, I'm feeling good about this. We can probably ship this in 1 year. That sounds good. And then it shipped 3 years later, so yeah. But in late 2015, we did produce a playable demo. I think we had like the first chapter had some rough art in it, and kind of play it. And we began playtesting it with people, and we submitted it to some events. I showed Pillar at a bunch of different conventions, PAX West, PAX East, GDC, a bunch of different things. So I was excited about maybe trying to get that into some events and make the big public announcement for the game. And so we did some play tests. Oh, here's some initial character designs he was doing. In the final version of the game, we trimmed the height of the characters down quite a bit. That's the children versions there. This is actually in the final version of the game, but it's looking pretty rough right here. A lot of unfinished detail, and there's a bar above the character's head, which is not in the final version. I'm not even actually sure what that bar is for, but yeah. And here is more towards the end of chapter 1. And actually, the guy down there, that's supposed to be a cat or an animal, and it's just a static stick figure from the previous game we threw in there. So yeah, it was rough, but you could kind of play through it, right? And the first playtests were a total disaster. It was similar feedback to Sententia. Similar frustrations, people were rage quitting. I did make changes to the game, though. I would point that out. I didn't just like copy before. I was trying to fix what the problems were. And I restructured the combat to be kind of like this Simon matching type of gameplay. Like there was 3 different colors of words, and you'd stand there and there'd be like 12 different words. You had to match each color. And that just wasn't interesting. It wasn't interesting to people, and they were firing so fast, constantly, people just threw down the controller. The puzzles, again, were kind of boring. I was really proud of the puzzle design in Pillar, but I felt like I wasn't utilizing what went right in that game in this game. There wasn't enough restraint in the puzzle mechanics. Again, you could just kind of solve these puzzles in a bunch of different ways, and maybe that's a good thing depending on what you're going for, but I'm interested in puzzle design where you have these very specific situations or very specific solutions that are interesting, and these puzzles weren't. And the story was really vague and lacked structure. I was trying to speak like through metaphor, and there wasn't like a whole lot of traditional narrative, and people, like the comments were literally, I have no reason to invest in these characters, and I have no idea what's going on. So first play tests weren't good. And we were rejected from everything we submitted the game into. I submitted, like I said, all of those events and some other things. And I even had, there was one judge panel that actually emailed me, and they said, we loved Pillar, but this didn't even seem like it was from the same Pillar developer. We were shocked that you even made this. So yeah, it didn't go too well. So at this point, I'm like, man, maybe this game concept just isn't going to be good. Maybe I should just do something else, right? Every time I try and work on this game, people don't seem to like it too much. But instead of just throwing it away, I tried to think more critically about what exactly were people saying in that feedback. Right, like a lot of times when you do playtesting, people will say stuff like, they may say totally off-the-wall stuff, like, you know what, make this game better? An RPG. You can have like a bazooka in there, like totally off-the-wall feedback. And like the first knee-jerk reactions would be like, you're an idiot, that's not what the game's about, right? But if you actually listen a little bit deeper, like there's certain things that, especially when you get a bunch of people saying similar things, there's a reason why they're saying that, right? And I tried to be a little more critical about the problems, and then I decided to redesign the entire game for a third time. Third time's charm, as they say. So the first thing I did is I scrapped the sequence matching combat. Like I said, there's a lot of like Simon Says type of combat. There's like 12 different words being fired at a time, and you just stand there and match everything. I scrapped that. There's still some color matching, but you don't sit there for so long. It's like a little more traditional in terms of the pacing of the combat. And I also applied psychological thinking to the combat. Like Pillar was very inspired by psychology, like I said, the introverts and all that kind of theory. I tried to apply that to the combat system here by asking questions like, why do people resort to violence? Why do people play the game this certain way? And I tried to design the combat in a way where you could kind of have a moment of reflection as the player about your own mind of what's going on, right? Your own psychology. So I refocused the combat around a hidden spoiler that I don't want to spoil in case you haven't played the game. But so I drastically overhauled that. And the platforming basically became puzzle solving in a way. That sounds maybe a little weird, but if you play the game, it makes sense, right? There's very specific solutions through the platform sections. I did keep the combat brutal because the theme of the game was like perseverance, right? And the idea of being beat down constantly, but you still like get back up and keep going. I wanted to have that feeling in it. But the problem in the last versions was it was just way too much of that, and people had no idea how to actually progress in the game, right? So what I did was I tried to make the solutions to these combat sections more clear. They were still brutal, but the ways around them were more obvious to players in the new version. For the puzzles, I completely scrapped all of them that I had, and I revisited the core mechanic. I added more restraint. And what I mean by that is previously you could just draw lines between all of the nodes, and there wasn't a lot of restriction there. Instead, in the new rule set, you can only draw nodes in cardinal directions. And that sounds like a really easy or like trivial thing to do, but it made the solutions to the puzzles a lot more specific. And I could explore and come up with more interesting puzzles that way, just with that one little change by itself. And through all this, I stumbled into a new way of designing puzzles. Like I said, I'm really interested in like how gameplay can inform story. And I found a way to design puzzles. Again, I'm a psychology nerd, but I found a way to design puzzles in a way where when you solve them, you're kind of, the thought process that you go through is kind of what the main character is going through. And to give an example of what I mean by that, the first side area in the game is this cave. And you find this poem that the character has written, and he talks about feeling isolated from people. And he just wants to be alone in this cave. But then later in the poem it talks about, well, even though I want to be isolated, I can't really do that. I have family and friends and so on outside of this cave I have to be connected with. And after you get done reading that little poem, you start solving these puzzles. And I designed them in a way where the intuitive thing that people want to do was isolate the nodes. That's how they think you're going to solve it. And then parts of the poem play, and people kind of have this aha moment, like, oh, no, I can't isolate, we have to connect them. Right, so I did a whole lot of things like that, like trying to link the puzzle design back into the story, and back and forth. And I'm really proud of how those ended up. They're fun, and also they kind of do cool creative things. For the narrative, I try to give more context and make it more of a traditional story. I gave the characters names before they were all nameless, and I tried to write the dialogue in a little bit more of a clear style. And also, so I also reinforced the theme of perseverance through the audio as well. So like there's this one part in the game where you're like constantly getting beat down by these really harsh enemies, and in the audio you hear me whispering that you should just give up and turn off the game and that you'll never get through the section and stuff like that. So all these small little touches backed up helped reinforce the themes I was trying to get across. I think people understood the game a lot more clearly after I made these changes. So at this point, like I overhauled so much of the game that we decided to just rename it. It didn't feel like at all like the old game. So we renamed the character Motus, which is Latin, and we decided, well, that's the main character, that's what the game's about, we'll call it the Path of Motus, and that's what we called it. And at this point, I came up with the hook of the game, or the elevator pitch, and I called it a game where your words can destroy people. And I'll explain this later, but that's a mistake. You should have your pitch at the beginning, not halfway through development, but whatever. So at this point, I focused on audio and making small design tweaks. Most of the game was done on my end in terms of the design and the program, like the engine programming and stuff. The majority of the work was the art, and that took a long time. If you notice in the screenshots, there's a very the style of art that we went for was very, I don't want to say professional, but like very detailed, right? Like a lot of indie games have a very lo-fi art style, and he opted for he was wanting like Ori and the Blind Forest level art. And he's a really good artist, but he's only one person. And so it took him a long time to come up with any of that stuff. I mean, that one picture I showed of like the cave-looking entrance, that took him 3 weeks. And that's just one small section of the game. So yeah, the game took a long time. And he actually flew here to stay with me for 6 months to try and finish up the game. Side story, he was detained by the TSA and had his phone searched, and he was docked from 6 months down the tube, but we got him back up to 6. That's another talk discussion. But so after the 6 months, the art still wasn't finished. And it took another 8 months on top of that to finish it. So we actually thought the game was going to take a year originally. Now we're way over that budget, right? What we set out to do. But we did announce the game in late 2017 through Sony and Microsoft channels. They let us post the trailer on their YouTube channel, and Sony tweeted about it and stuff like that. The plan was make the announcement and then launch within 6 months. As always, that didn't happen. But to my surprise, a lot of people, I was looking through the Twitter searches, a lot of people remembered the game as Sententia, which I didn't think would be possible, because Sententia had launched like 5 years or something like that before. So that made me feel kind of good. Of course, a lot of them didn't remember it in a positive light, but the fact that they still remembered something from it made me feel kind of good, right? Like there's something there that stuck with people. We also entered into a partnership with the CyberSmile Foundation, and basically they're an anti-bullying organization. They work with kids, and they provide educational resources to schools and stuff like that. And we pledged to donate 10% of the sales to what they were doing. So in late 2017, this is basically what it looks like in the final version. Notice there's a lot more detail in the tree, and it looks a lot more polished. This is the final version of that. In 2018, this is in chapter 2. Notice the main character actually grows older in each chapter, so this is the teenage version of the character. And you're solving a bridge puzzle at the end of chapter 2. So at this point, we started to prepare for launch because we felt like we were going to realistically get it out the door this time. And we had some cool opportunities. I resubmitted the game to some events, and we were picked to show the game at PAX East in Boston. And that was like the first major unveiling of the game, and we actually had a lot of media show up and cover the game, which was cool. I was a little nervous about the previews, because every other time we announced this game or did anything with it, it kind of flopped, but the previews were actually really positive. A couple of semi-big sites did a preview, and they actually said that it was the most interesting game they played at the whole convention. So that gave me a little bit of optimism finally after all of that. It was also a finalist for the Indie Game Award at MomoCon. That's a convention down in Atlanta. It's actually one of the bigger game conventions in the South. But we were finalists for that. And through CyberSmile, our partnership, I worked with a PR agency for the first time. The Plan of Attack is their name. They worked on some bigger indie titles. One of them you might know of is Snake Pass, I think is what it's called, where you play as the snake and you wind around things with the Switch controller. They did some other games too. That was nice, because in the past I was handling all of the PR stuff. I still did a lot of it. I still wrote the press emails, the press packets, came up with all that stuff. And then I could just give it to them, and they emailed it to 20,000 people, which was nice, because I don't have to look up emails and do all that stuff. Just give it to them. And this time we sent out review codes early, so the press could do reviews. Last time with Pillar, I didn't get the review codes until after the game launched. And what had happened was I talked to some of the bigger sites like IGN and stuff. They basically told me, we're not going to cover this because we only cover games when they're hot, right on release, and now you've only got these codes after launch. So I screwed that up with Pillar, but we did it right this time. And the days before launch, I was pretty depressed. Not to make this a woe is me thing, but when you spend 3 years of your life on this one moment, and it's kind of well, tomorrow either the 3 years were a failure or a success. It's you kind of just shut down. And it happened with Pillar too. It's just a lot of mental stress. But it was easier this time, because last time, I got through it with Pillar, so I was well, the game will come out and whatever happens, happens, I'll live, right? I did expect the game to fail because it failed every other time we did anything with it, right? But like I said, the previews at PAX gave me a little bit of hope. So, and days before launch, something that never happened. Usually, like my experience with reviewers is they kind of keep their distance for like professional reasons. They don't want to talk to me or get like too buddy-buddy. I had like 3 or 4 of them email me and write like lengthy paragraphs about how touched they were by the game, and some of them even said it made them cry, which I was like, well, maybe we'll do okay after all, because I never thought I'd get that reaction from people. So that was good. I started to slowly feel a little more optimistic, more and more. And finally, the game launched on July 17th for the first 3 platforms we launched for. And like I said, the Switch version came out this February. So that's the story of everything, and I've had a lot of time to reflect on like what went right and what went wrong. So I'm going to break this down into the classic Post-Mortem, game developer magazine style thing. And I'm going to start with what went right. And I think what went right is the design. My original creative goals of kind of meshing the level design, all that stuff with the story, that seemed to really work. People got it this time and were touched by it, and it was a fun game to play too. The puzzles were interesting, like they did some cool creative stuff, but they were also challenging and engaging and all that. So I'm happy with the design. Like I said, the combat sections, they made a point about human psychology. Like a lot of people that played this game, they had a lot of epiphanies like in the combat, and that was cool. Sorry I'm being vague, but go play the game. I don't want to spoil it. Another thing that went right is audio. I made a dynamic audio engine, and that was helpful because I could constantly make the music change based off what's going on in the game. And I personally really like when games do that. It makes things more cohesive, I think. So I was really happy with that. The environment art looked really good. I was really proud of Goncalo and everything. And when you're a small team of like 2 or 3 people, everything just feels so like more personal and tightly integrated. And that's because every time we'd start on a section of the level, I'd send Goncalo a wall of text on Facebook Messenger trying to explain what exactly I wanted, and he kind of would grab onto that and put his own spin on it, and it just felt really felt kind of married, I guess is the right word. The story seemed to work real well. Like I said, it connected with people. And one of my goals I had with the game was I was inspired by a lot of like creative stories of creative people, and I was hoping that it would inspire other people to maybe go out and do their own thing, right? Like make your own game if that's what you want to do, or pursue music, like whatever your dream was. I was hoping it'd like be a little push for people, and it was. I had people email me and tweet at me saying that after playing this game, they wanted to make an indie game and stuff like that. So that was really cool. The partnerships with Microsoft, Sony, and CyberSmile went really well. There was people at Microsoft and Sony that were really big advocates for the game. They were always promoting the game in other group settings, trying to get coverage for it and stuff like that. They were a big fan. Feel very grateful for that. CyberSmile, through them I worked with the PR agency, which was really nice. And it gave like another dimension to the game, right? It gave me a way to give back, right? And it connected things back to real life, right? Because I think a lot of people were really excited by the idea of when they bought the game, they could also help out a charity. A lot of people thought that was cool. So the promotion went well. We had a lot of promotion from small to mid-tier sites and a few big ones. We had reviews from official Xbox Magazine and IGN. PlayStation tweeted about it to their 15 million people 3 times or so, something like that, and they put it in their digital gems category of the store. Microsoft chose it as a headliner for Game Fest 2019, which is like, that's like their headline. It's like the old Summer of Arcade on 360, if people are familiar with that. So got a lot of coverage. We had 2 or 3 local TV people come out and do stories. Art Holiday, he's a famous reporter here on Channel 5. He's actually like the longest running reporter, I think, in the country for local news. He's really cool. But he drove all the way out to my house. I live like an hour and a half away. He drove all the way out and did a story, and it was just so cool. And I'm really thankful for everybody, even if you just like sent out a tweet about the game. I appreciate everybody that spread the word about it. And here's the review. We reviewed in IGN Greece, the Greece version of IGN, and very interestingly, they reviewed the game higher than Spider-Man for PS4, which that's very controversial. I would probably even debate that, right? I like Spider-Man quite a bit, but there we are, 7.7, just 0.2 above Spider-Man. What do you know? So. And this is Game Fest on Xbox One. This was earlier this year. So we were on the front page of the Games tab alongside some other cool games like Celeste. That's a pretty cool platformer if you haven't played it. Another thing that went right was the game's price. So last time with Pillar, what I did is I thought, okay, what's a fair price that everyone would think is an all right price to pay for this game? I was like, oh, $8 sounds good. That's my gut feeling. And then what happened was, in reviews and stuff, a lot of people were like, that's just the right price point. That's perfect. But then what happened was, actually, statistically speaking, the majority of sales actually came when we put the game at a discount, like on Steam sale or on PlayStation sale or whatever. So I learned from that no matter what price point you put it at, people are going to wait for a sale. So what I did this time is I said, what's a fair price in my gut? And I was like, 10 or 12 bucks. I was like, well, let's mark that up a few. And then like a month or so after launch, we did like a 15% discount, and then we had all of our sales, and then everybody bought it at the price point I thought was fair. So many people are rolling their eyes at that, but it worked, and yeah. So I would encourage anybody that's like thinking about pricing their game right now, if there's any game developers here, maybe price just a little bit higher than what you think is fair to counter for all of the sales culture stuff. The commercial performance of the game, it was a minor success for such a niche game. It outperformed 4 years of Pillar revenue in less than 1 year. However, there's a big however, this is when we go into the what went wrong. The development just took way too long, right? It didn't make 3 years worth of money. It was way too eccentric of a game to devote 3 years of development into. And this goes back to what I was saying earlier about, when you evaluate your game concepts, it's good to think, because I'm not saying like you shouldn't make cool creative stuff. Like I want to keep making small, cool creative games too, but like try to limit yourself to like 6 months for those. You know what I'm saying? Like I'm not sure they devote the full, or they deserve the full 3-year thing unless you're really sure they're going to make return, right? And I wish we live in a world where I could just put out all my games for free, but I like to try and do it full time. So I do think about those things. And the main reason I think the game took so long was the art style we picked. And it goes back to earlier what I was saying about, like, notice everything was very detailed. Ori and the Blind Forest, the art in that looks amazing. And it's cool. I'm glad we set our bar high for that. But the reality is, like, he's one person and there's a team of like 6 or more artists on Ori and the Blind Forest, right? So I think in the future, I'm hoping we can pick a more lo-fi aesthetic for the art. And that kind of comes with some negative, I don't mean like, you can have lo-fi stuff that looks really good, right? But just it can be easier to execute for one person. And that's what I'm after, like a cool, unique art style that's easier or quicker to get done. I think that would tremendously help what we're doing. Another thing that went wrong was the programming choices. I over-engineered a lot of problems. I made them bigger. The advice I give to programmers is always just go for the simplest thing at first, right? Like the classic programmer problem is the first thing you're going to do is like make the perfect solution, right? And design all of these systems and like go fully in depth. And a lot of times what I find is when I do that, and then I'm done with the engineering side, I put my design hat back on, and I realize, well, that doesn't even work in the game. So then I have to scrap all that stuff. So to me, it makes more sense to just very quickly get something up on the screen, and then as time goes on, if it ends up that is needed in the final version, then we can return and kind of make it prettier and perfect it a little bit more. But otherwise, I just feel like trying to do the best thing first time, in my case, it wastes a lot of time. Maybe that's not true in bigger teams, but in small teams, it's definitely true. That was a big problem I had. And another thing is I kept programming content. I kept making new systems for content instead of programming one system and then putting a bunch of content into it. And if that doesn't make sense, like usually what you do in video games is the programmer will program one system of, let's say, you're making like crops that you can pick in some type of farming game, right? And you program that, and then all you have to do at that point is make a bunch of crops for that system, right? And you're reusing all of that engineering stuff that you've done. I didn't do anything like that. Like every time we had something new in the game, I re-engineered and had a whole new system, right? So that took a lot extra. That was stupid. I shouldn't have done that. The Steam release went really wrong. Less than 1% of our sales came from Steam. And the reason for that, I think, is that small games aren't placed very well on the storefront. They are very hands-off, Valve is. Everything's algorithm-based. So you don't have a person there, or at least I don't. Like some people have people, some people don't. I don't quite understand how they operate there. So what happens is, if you're not making a game that fits into their algorithm where you get placement, you're basically screwed. So yeah, I don't really like how Valve does things. Some people do. I could talk about it more, but there was an article I was interviewed for on Polygon, and it was called Steam Developers Speak, Maximum Profits for Valve, Minimum Responsibilities. And if you're interested more in my viewpoints on that, you can Google that, and there's some other developers that talk about it too. Another thing that went wrong is when we were showing the game at various conventions, I ran to a bunch of teachers that were saying, man, at school I have to talk about bullying, like it's mandated in Illinois and some other places. And it always comes across as a dry subject. I really would like to use your game in the classroom to talk about this stuff. I'd really be interested in that. And I had several teachers say that. And I was like, well, I mean, everybody's asking for this, so let's try and do it. So I made an educational version of the game. We made like a little pamphlet that kind of gives things for the teachers to talk about that links back into the game and so on and so forth. I went to an educational conference in Springfield and showed the game and tried to make some connections with teachers. There seemed to be a lot of interest, but what I found is that this is kind of like starting from scratch, right? Like it's all new connections, and then they seem to have like a lot of red tape. Like they can't just buy the game. They have to like get approval from administrators and all this stuff. So long story short, there seems to be interest, but there's zero sales currently in that, and I feel like I just don't have the resources to pursue it properly right now. I actually have one person, there might be something that happens with this in the future. I can't talk about it, but this might be revived. But right now I would write it off as a failure that maybe could have been more. Another thing that went really wrong was the trailer. And I have a thing when I cut trailers, I like to focus on having a cool music track and focus on narrative elements. And I like how the trailer came across, but I don't think it does a good job selling the game, like showing cool things in the gameplay that the players actually do to excite people in the trailer. I even had some comments from people that I think sums up what I did. Somebody said, you forgot that you're advertising a game and you focus too heavily on these other things, and I think that's accurate. I do like the trailer personally, but I would restructure it if I was doing it again. Like I was saying earlier, the coolest part of the combat is a spoiler. So of course I don't want to show that in the trailer. So it just looks like when people are fighting it, they're just standing there and throwing projectiles, and like you don't see what's really cool about the combat because I didn't want to spoil that. So I mean, maybe the solution is showing the spoiler, but I don't like when games do that. So I don't know. There's different ways to solve that problem, but I think I screwed up the trailer. I think I had a weak elevator pitch. I came up with the pitch halfway through development. Like I said, you should be thinking about that. That's the first thing you should be thinking about, right? Like, is this an exciting hook that would excite the common man or woman at GameStop, right? And the thing is, if you're not interested in doing this full time, you just want to make a cool game, don't even worry about that stuff, right? But if you are interested in like making enough return to keep doing this as like a career, that's something I would strongly recommend you think about. It's the pitch and how people would respond to it. And the final pitch we did come up with, it was a game where words destroy. That's kind of interesting, right? Like it kind of piques the brain a little bit, but it doesn't paint a clear picture of what you actually do in the game, what's cool about it, and why people should care, right? So I think I could do a much better job with the kind of the PR pitch stuff in the future. And then finally, the last thing that went wrong is that I got really lost in the details of everything. So to do any development as a small team, which is what we are, you have to wear many hats, right? And those hats come with different styles of thinking. So engineer thinking is way different than design thinking, and design thinking is way different than marketing thinking. It's all totally different ways. Like what engineers think is cool is not necessarily what the general public thinks is cool, right? And a lot of times where I get stuck in is engineer thinking, right? I'm constantly coding, I think about all this cool stuff, and like, oh, people are going to think it's awesome that this game pushes 1,000 polys, and like nobody cares, you know what I mean? But, like, I do, but like the common player, they don't see that stuff, right? So yeah, I think as a small indie team, you have to be really good at all styles of thinking, and it's hard for me to switch hats and be like, okay, today I'm no longer a programmer, I'm a designer, or whatever it is, right? I struggle with that, but hopefully I can get better. So the conclusion is, I still have a lot to learn, and successful indie development requires a lot of sacrifice and many years of failure. I do feel like the game was a minor success, but I still have a lot to learn. And I feel like in game development, you know, when you read stuff on websites and such, we have a tendency to really elevate the people who have a lot of success financially. But if you actually look a little deeper into anybody's story, there's always years and years of failure, of going bankrupt, of living in poverty off credit cards and stuff like that. Like, that's the reality of it. Even if you go back to like the very first, well, it wasn't the very first, but you know, 2008, around 2010, when there was a bunch of those big indie hits like Braid and stuff. You know, a lot of people thought Braid was Jonathan Blow's first game, but he actually started a game in the 90s, a game company, and went bankrupt and lost hundreds and thousands of dollars. And the people who made Super Meat Boy lived off credit cards. And it's not all that glamorous, really. It takes a long time to get really good at doing this, right? And that would be a message I would send to anybody thinking about doing this. Just know what you're getting into. It's a lot of fun, but it takes a lot of time to learn and get good at it. But just like Motus, if you persevere and learn from your mistakes, I think you can reach the end of the forest. And I'm not sure how much time I have, but maybe we can take questions. Thanks so much for coming. Yep. Okay, we have time for questions. Does anyone have a question or a comment? Or a cool game that you played recently? Okay, I know you're lying now. No one's played any cool games recently? No? We all just watch movies or something else instead? We don't play games, but we came to a game convention? Okay. Yeah, the question was, as an engineer, did you run into any technical difficulties or engineering difficulties? And the answer was yes. So I write my games in C#. And so I have my own engine, and it's based in C# and XNA mono game, if you're familiar. And the problem that I ran into is that when trying to port the game to Nintendo Switch, they don't support managed code. So I had to convert all of my code to native C++ and then run the game like that. And luckily, I have a friend that has a compiler. It's actually open source right now. It's called Brute. But it takes C# code, managed C# code, and automatically translates it to C++. So luckily, I didn't have to touch too much C++ stuff. But that was probably the biggest technical thing I ran into, I think. Yeah. So, any other questions? Uh-huh. The exclusivity deal on the Epic Game Store? Is that the question? I don't have too much of an opinion about that, but based off what I have, like I'm in the talks with Epic about being on the Epic Game Store. They haven't said anything about the exclusivity thing, but I'm just happy that so far it seems like they're going to give me a contact at Epic that I can communicate to. And if they do that, that's already a lot better than Valve. That's my only commentary on that. I don't really know much else. I'm not in the store yet, but I've been talking to them, so yeah. Any other questions or comments? What's our favorite game of all time? Not game we played recently. Chrono Trigger? Yeah? I haven't played that one, actually. No one else wants to shout out anything?
Destiny 2.
Destiny 2? Yeah? I haven't played that one either. I guess that's kind of sad. I haven't played a lot of games. Did anyone play Breath of the Wild? 2 thumbs up?
It's a lot of exploring. I get lost easily.
I like that. I like to explore. All right, well, I'm going to quit wasting your time. Thank you for coming.